Every father knows the crushing weight of failing to provide for his child. Mark Ellison felt that burden heavier than most as he stood outside the abandoned bunker he'd just bought for $3,000, every penny he had left. His 8-year-old daughter, Emma, looked up at the concrete structure with wide eyes. The whole town had laughed at him for buying what they called the concrete tomb. His neighbors whispered behind his back, saying he'd lost his mind along with his job. Mark had bought this old WWII bunker because it was all he could afford after losing everything. But when he started cleaning it out, he found something hidden beneath the floor, something that had been waiting 70 years to be discovered. A secret worth $204 million. But what happens when the wrong people find out what you've discovered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mark Ellison twisted the simple gold wedding band around his ring finger, a habit he'd developed in the 2 years since Sarah's death. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of their cramped one-bedroom apartment, casting long shadows across Emma's drawings taped to the refrigerator. Each colorful picture showed the same theme, a little girl and her daddy, always holding hands. "Morning, sunshine," Mark whispered as Emma padded into the kitchen, her dark hair tousled from sleep. She had her mother's eyes warm brown with flecks of gold that caught the light when she smiled. Those eyes had been Mark's anchor through the darkest days of his life. "Are we really going to live in that place today, Daddy?" Emma asked, climbing onto the kitchen stool that wobbled despite Mark's repeated attempts to fix it. Everything in their world seemed to wobble these days, their finances, their future, Mark's confidence as a father. Mark poured orange juice into Emma's favorite cup, the one with the chipped handle that Sarah had bought at a garage sale years ago. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away, just like he couldn't remove his wedding ring or pack away Sarah's books that still lined their makeshift shelf. "We're going to take a look at it first," Mark said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at his chest. "Remember what Mummy always said about adventures?" Emma's face brightened. "Every adventure starts with a single brave step." Sarah had said that during Emma's first day of kindergarten, and again when they'd moved to this small town of Cedar Falls after her cancer diagnosis, Sarah believed that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but taking that step forward despite being afraid. Mark wondered what she would think of this particular step he was taking. The bunker had been advertised in the local paper's classified section, buried between ads for used furniture and farm equipment. Historic WWII structure, sold as is. 3-0 firm. Mark had called the number 3 times before working up the courage to arrange a meeting with the seller, an elderly man named Henry Walsh, whose grandfather had owned the property. "Most folks think I'm crazy for even trying to sell it," Henry had said, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he signed the deed transfer. "Been sitting empty for 70 years. Nothing but concrete and bad memories, if you ask the old-timers in town." But Mark wasn't asking the old-timers. He was asking his empty bank account and the eviction notice tucked behind Emma's artwork on the refrigerator. $3,000 was everything he had left after the medical bills, the funeral expenses, and 18 months of unemployment in a town where construction work had dried up like autumn leaves. His mother-in-law, Patricia, had made her position clear during their last phone call. "That child needs stability, Mark. She needs a proper home with proper supervision. If you can't provide that—" Mark had hung up before she could finish the threat they both knew she was capable of carrying out. Patricia had never approved of her daughter marrying a construction worker, and Sarah's death had given her ammunition she'd been stockpiling for years. The court-appointed social worker, Mrs. Chen, was kind but thorough. She'd been understanding about Mark's employment situation, but understanding only stretched so far when a child's welfare was involved. "The bunker might not look like much from the outside," Mark told Emma, as they drove the winding road toward the outskirts of town. His pickup truck rattled over every pothole, the engine making sounds that reminded him of his dwindling savings account. But sometimes the most important things are hidden where we least expect them. Emma pressed her nose against the passenger window, watching the countryside roll past. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business, where gossip traveled faster than the internet, and where a man buying an abandoned bunker became the subject of coffee shop conversations for weeks. "Mrs. Patterson says you lost your mind," Emma said matter-of-factly. Their elderly neighbor had never mastered the art of whispering, and her opinions carried through paper-thin apartment walls. Mark's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Patterson says a lot of things, but Miss Rodriguez says sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices that other people don't understand." Emma's teacher had been a bright spot during the darker months, offering patience and extra attention when Emma's grief made concentration difficult. The bunker sat on 12 acres of overgrown pasture, accessible only by a gravel road that had seen better decades. Mark's pickup crunched over broken stones and scattered debris as they approached what the townspeople had nicknamed the concrete tomb. It was, Mark had to admit, an imposing sight. The main structure rose from the earth like a grey monument to forgotten wars, its flat roof covered in weeds and its walls stained with decades of weather. Small, rectangular windows, now covered with rusted metal sheets, dotted the facade like closed eyes. The entire structure measured roughly 60 feet long by 30 feet wide, built from reinforced concrete thick enough to withstand bombing runs that never came to rural Pennsylvania. "It looks like a giant's grave," Emma observed, her voice small in the vast silence that surrounded them. Mark parked the truck and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Home isn't a place, Mark. It's wherever we choose to build our love." She'd said that during their first apartment viewing, a cramped space above a bakery that smelled like yeast and dreams. "Come on, sweetheart," Mark said, opening his door. "Let's see what we've got." The heavy metal door at the bunker's entrance groaned on hinges that hadn't moved in years. Mark had oiled them during his initial inspection, but they still protested with every movement. Inside, the air was cool and musty, carrying the scent of concrete dust and time itself. The main room stretched the length of the structure, its ceiling supported by massive concrete beams. Scattered throughout the space were rusted barrels, broken wooden crates, and the detritus of decades-old newspapers, empty bottles, machinery parts whose original purpose had been forgotten along with the men who'd used them. Emma stayed close to Mark's side, her small hand finding his. "It's bigger than our apartment," she whispered. It was bigger, Mark realized. Much bigger. The main room alone was larger than their entire living space, and according to the property survey, there were additional chambers he hadn't yet explored. With some work, some imagination, and a lot of elbow grease, this place could become something more than a concrete tomb. It could become home. "What do you think, Em?" Mark asked, kneeling to her level. "Think we could make this work?" Emma walked to one of the covered windows and traced patterns in the dust with her finger. "Mummy always said every place has a story waiting to be discovered." Sarah had been the dreamer in their marriage, the one who saw potential where others saw problems. She'd painted their first apartment in colors that shouldn't have worked together, but somehow created magic. She'd turned their tiny backyard into a garden that produced tomatoes the size of baseballs and sunflowers that towered over the fence. "She did say that," Mark agreed, his throat tight with memory. "So what's this place's story, Daddy?" Mark looked around the cavernous space, at the shadows dancing in corners where his flashlight couldn't reach, at the mysterious doors leading to unexplored chambers, at the layers of history written in dust and rust and silence. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but maybe that's our adventure finding out together." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old logic. Children, Mark had learned, were remarkably adaptable when the adults in their lives provided consistency and love. Emma had weathered her mother's illness, death, and their subsequent struggles with a resilience that both amazed and humbled him. As they explored the main chamber, Mark's mind raced with possibilities. The concrete walls were solid, the structure sound despite its age. With proper insulation, heating, and some creative renovation, this could become not just livable, but comfortable. The 12 acres provided privacy and space for Emma to play, something their apartment had never offered. More importantly, it was theirs. No landlord to satisfy, no rent to scramble for each month, no threat of eviction hanging over their heads. For the first time in 2 years, Mark felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. "Can I pick my room?" Emma asked, pointing toward one of the side chambers. "Let's explore first," Mark said, pulling his flashlight from his toolbox. "Make sure it's safe." They spent the next hour walking through the bunker's various rooms, Mark taking mental notes about necessary repairs, while Emma spun stories about what each space could become. The smaller chambers could serve as bedrooms, the larger ones as living areas. There was even what appeared to be an old kitchen space, though it would need complete renovation. In the easternmost chamber, Emma discovered something that made her gasp with delight. A small window that had been left uncovered, allowing afternoon sunlight to stream across the concrete floor. "This can be my room," she announced with the certainty that only children possess. "The sunshine will wake me up every morning, just like Mommy used to do." Mark's heart clenched. Sarah had always been the first one awake, tiptoeing into Emma's room to open curtains and whisper silly songs until their daughter giggled herself into consciousness. These small connections to their past life felt both precious and painful. As evening approached, they drove back to their apartment in comfortable silence. Emma fell asleep against the passenger window, exhausted by the day's adventure. Mark carried her upstairs, tucked her into the small bed they'd wedged into the apartment's single bedroom, and kissed her forehead. In the kitchen, he made himself a cup of coffee and sat at their tiny table, surrounded by the boxes they'd never fully unpacked because this place had never felt permanent. On the refrigerator, Emma's drawings caught his eye, all those pictures of a father and daughter holding hands, facing adventures together. Mark pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Henry Walsh's number. "Mr. Walsh, it's Mark Ellison. About the bunker, I'll take it." The moving truck disappeared down the gravel road in a cloud of dust, leaving Mark and Emma standing beside their modest pile of belongings. 3 years of marriage, 2 years of widowhood, and 8 years of fatherhood reduced to cardboard boxes and plastic containers that looked pitifully small against the concrete vastness of their new home. "Well," Mark said, forcing brightness into his voice, "here we are." Emma nodded seriously, clutching her stuffed rabbit, a threadbare companion named Mr. Hops that had survived her mother's illness and their subsequent upheavals. "It smells different than our apartment." She was right. The bunker carried scents that their cramped apartment never had. Concrete dust, metal rust, earth, and something else Mark couldn't identify, a staleness that spoke of decades undisturbed. "Different doesn't mean bad," Mark said, echoing words Sarah had spoken during Emma's first day at a new school. "Sometimes different means the beginning of something wonderful." They spent the morning arranging their furniture in the main chamber, creating islands of familiarity in an ocean of grey concrete. Emma's bed went in the eastern room with the uncovered window, while Mark claimed a smaller, adjacent space. Their kitchen table looked absurdly small in the center of the main room, but Emma insisted it was perfect for tea parties with Mr. Hops. By afternoon, Emma had grown restless with the unpacking routine. "Can I play outside, Daddy?" Mark glanced through the window at the overgrown fields surrounding their new home. 12 acres of freedom stretched in every direction, more space than Emma had ever had to herself. "Stay where I can see you from the window," he said, "and don't go near the road." Emma skipped outside with Mr. Hops, her laughter echoing across the empty landscape. For the first time since Sarah's death, Mark heard pure joy in his daughter's voice. Perhaps this move, desperate as it had been, might actually give Emma what she needed most: room to heal and grow. Alone in the bunker, Mark turned his attention to the mess left by 7 decades of neglect. Rusted barrels lined one wall, their contents long since evaporated or crystallized into unidentifiable substances. Broken wooden crates scattered throughout the space bore faded military markings that were barely legible. Old newspapers, brittle with age, contained headlines about rationing and victory gardens. Mark started with the newspapers, carefully gathering them into piles for disposal. The dates ranged from 1943 to 1945, chronicling the final years of World War II. Some were local papers from Cedar Falls, others from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Mixed among them were official-looking documents bearing military seals, though most were too deteriorated to read clearly. One headline caught his attention: "Local Bunker Facility Aids War Effort." The accompanying article was mostly illegible, but Mark could make out references to strategic storage and classified materials. He set it aside, thinking Emma might find it interesting to learn their new home had played a role in history. The wooden crates proved more challenging. Most had rotted beyond salvage, their contents scattered across the concrete floor: rusty tools, corroded metal parts, and what appeared to be the remains of radio equipment. But as Mark cleared away the debris, he noticed something odd about the flooring beneath. In the northwest corner of the main chamber, several concrete blocks seemed different from the rest. While the surrounding floor was smooth and uniform, these blocks appeared rougher, as if they'd been removed and replaced at some point. Mark knelt and ran his hands along the edges, feeling slight gaps that shouldn't exist in properly poured concrete. "That's strange," he murmured, then dismissed the observation. Old buildings often showed signs of repair work, and a structure this age had probably seen its share of maintenance. But as he continued cleaning, the irregularity nagged at him. He fetched a screwdriver from his toolbox and probed gently along the edges of the suspicious blocks. The tool slipped into gaps that were definitely not supposed to exist. "Daddy," Emma's voice carried through the window, "come see what I found." Mark set down the screwdriver and stepped outside. Emma stood near a cluster of oak trees at the property's eastern edge, her hands cupped around something small. "Look," she whispered, opening her palms to reveal a tiny bird with a damaged wing. "I think he fell from his nest." Mark examined the bird carefully. It was young, probably just learning to fly, and the wing didn't appear broken, just bruised. "He needs rest and quiet," Mark said. "Should we make him a safe place to recover?" Emma's face lit up. "Can we? Really?" They spent the next hour creating a makeshift recovery area in a cardboard box, lined with soft cloth and placed in the shade of the kitchen area. The bird seemed calmer once settled, and Emma appointed herself his caretaker. "What should we name him?" she asked. "What do you think?" Emma studied the small creature thoughtfully. "Hope," she said finally, "because Mommy always said hope has feathers." Mark's throat tightened. Sarah had read Emily Dickinson to Emma during bedtime stories, and that particular line had become a favorite. Hearing it now, in this concrete shelter they were trying to transform into home, felt like Sarah's presence blessing their new beginning. As evening approached and Emma focused on caring for Hope, Mark returned to the mysterious floor blocks. The gaps definitely weren't natural, and his construction experience told him these blocks had been deliberately placed rather than poured. But why would someone go to the trouble of creating removable sections in a bunker floor? He tried lifting one of the blocks, but it was far too heavy to move without equipment. However, when he probed deeper with the screwdriver, he felt hollow space beneath. The blocks weren't sitting on solid ground, they were covering something. Mark's pulse quickened. During his research into the property, he'd learned that many World War II-era installations had hidden compartments for storing sensitive materials. Could this bunker have a secret chamber that hadn't been discovered when the military abandoned the facility? "Daddy, Hope ate some of the seeds I gave him." Emma's excited voice interrupted his speculation. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mark said, quickly replacing his tools. Whatever lay beneath those blocks could wait. Emma's joy over the recovering bird was more important than satisfying his curiosity about architectural mysteries. But as they prepared dinner on their camping stove, Mark found himself glancing repeatedly at the northwest corner. The blocks sat innocuously among their scattered belongings, but now they seemed to pulse with possibility. What if the bunker's true value wasn't in its potential as a home, but in secrets it had been keeping for 7 decades? That night, after Emma fell asleep with Hope's box beside her bed, Mark sat alone in the main chamber with only a battery-powered lantern for company. The electricity wouldn't be connected until tomorrow, and the shadows cast by the flickering light made the bunker feel both ancient and alive. He found himself walking to the suspicious blocks, kneeling and probing the edges again. There was definitely a hollow space beneath, and the more he examined the craftsmanship, the more convinced he became that this was intentional concealment rather than poor construction. Mark made a decision. Tomorrow, while Emma was in school, he would rent the equipment needed to lift these blocks and see what lay beneath. If it was nothing more than an old storage pit or utility access, at least his curiosity would be satisfied. But if it was something more, something that had been hidden for 70 years, then perhaps their desperate gamble on this concrete tomb might prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. As he settled into his makeshift bedroom, Mark's mind raced with possibilities. The bunker's history was clearly more complex than Henry Walsh had indicated. The newspapers, the official documents, the references to classified materials, all suggested this facility had played a more important role in the war effort than anyone remembered. Outside, an owl called across the empty fields, and Mark smiled, thinking about Emma's rescue bird. Hope was already showing signs of recovery, just as they were both learning to heal in this unexpected sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries. Tonight, for the first time in months, Mark fell asleep without worrying about eviction notices or custody hearings. Whatever lay beneath those concrete blocks, it couldn't be worse than the uncertainty they'd left behind. He was wrong. Mark stood in the equipment rental yard at dawn, fog rising from the wet asphalt like ghostly fingers. The hydraulic jack he needed cost $60 for the day, money they couldn't really afford, but his curiosity had transformed into obsession overnight. "You sure you know what you're doing with this thing?" asked Jerry, the rental yard owner, as he helped Mark load the jack into his pickup. "These concrete blocks can be tricky. Seen more than one guy get crushed trying to lift what shouldn't be lifted." "I've worked construction for 15 years, Mark replied, though his confidence felt shakier than his voice suggested. "I know how to handle equipment safely." The drive back to the bunker took 20 minutes, giving Mark time to question his decision. Emma was safely at school, cared for by Miss Rodriguez, who'd agreed to watch her for an extra hour after classes ended. That gave him until 4 o'clock to investigate the mysterious blocks and clean up any evidence of his exploration. What if there was nothing beneath those blocks except old utility lines or storage pits? $60 wasted, plus the risk of damaging their new home's foundation. But what if there was something more, something that could change their circumstances entirely? Mark positioned the hydraulic jack carefully, studying the blocks he'd identified as suspicious. Up close, in morning light streaming through the windows, the craftsmanship became even more obvious. These blocks had been cut to fit precisely, their edges sealed with a different type of mortar than the surrounding floor. The first block resisted his initial attempts to lift it. Mark adjusted the jack's position, applied steady pressure, and felt the concrete shift slightly. Then, with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty bunker, the block rose 6 inches off the floor. Cool air rushed up from the gap, carrying a scent Mark recognized from his construction days. The smell of spaces that had been sealed for decades. He positioned his flashlight beam into the opening and peered down. A metal ladder descended into darkness. Mark's hands trembled as he lifted the jack higher, raising the block enough to reveal the full opening. The ladder was military-issue steel, still solid despite its age, leading down approximately 10 feet to what appeared to be a concrete floor. He removed 2 more blocks, widening the opening until he could safely climb down. The ladder held his weight without protest, and within moments, Mark stood in a hidden chamber that had been sealed since the end of World War II. The underground room stretched approximately 20 feet in each direction, its walls lined with metal shelving and wooden crates. Unlike the debris-filled bunker above, this space had been carefully organized and preserved. Dust covered everything, but Mark could see that whoever had sealed this chamber had intended for its contents to remain intact. His flashlight beam swept across labels written in faded ink: medical supplies, communications, equipment, personal effects. But it was the crates along the far wall that made Mark's breath catch in his throat. These wooden boxes were different from the rotted containers upstairs. Reinforced with metal bands and marked with military codes, they appeared to have been built for transporting valuable cargo. Mark approached the nearest crate and found its lid secured with a simple latch rather than nails. Inside, nestled in rotted velvet padding, were gold coins. Not just any coins, these bore the unmistakable stamp of the Third Reich, their surfaces still gleaming despite 7 decades in darkness. Mark lifted one with trembling fingers, feeling its substantial weight. His construction background had taught him enough about precious metals to recognize genuine gold when he saw it. The crate contained dozens of coins, organized in neat rows. Mark opened the adjacent crate and found more of the same, along with what appeared to be precious stones, emeralds, rubies, and diamonds that caught his flashlight beam and threw it back in brilliant fragments. "My God," Mark whispered, his voice swallowed by the chamber's silence. He moved methodically through the room, documenting what he found with his phone's camera. Each crate contained similar treasures: gold bars, jewelry, more coins, and stones. On the metal shelving, leather-bound ledgers recorded entries in multiple languages: German, French, English, with columns of numbers that suggested inventory records. In the corner of the chamber, Mark discovered something that made his heart race: a military footlocker with US Army stenciled on its side. Inside, he found documents bearing official seals, photographs of men in uniform, and a letter written on War Department letterhead. The letter was dated December 15, 1945, and addressed to Recovery Team 7. Mark's hands shook as he read the faded typescript. The materials secured during Operation Golden Dawn are to remain classified indefinitely. Under no circumstances should the recovered assets be transferred to standard military channels. These items represent recovered Allied property, stolen by enemy forces, and must be preserved as evidence for future war crimes proceedings. The letter was signed by a General Morrison, whose signature had faded but remained legible. Mark photographed the letter and continued exploring. The chamber contained more than just treasure. It held the remnants of a secret operation that had been buried along with the end of the war. The ledgers detailed the recovery of stolen art, gold, and precious stones from Nazi supply lines, all catalogued and stored in this hidden vault. But why had it been abandoned? Why hadn't the military recovered these materials after the war ended? Mark's phone buzzed with a text from Miss Rodriguez. "Emma's doing great. She's helping me grade papers. Take your time." The message reminded Mark that he had a life above ground, a daughter who needed him, and responsibilities that extended beyond this underground treasure chamber. But as he climbed back up the ladder, his mind raced with possibilities. The conservative estimates he'd learned from watching appraisal shows suggested the gold alone could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The precious stones were harder to evaluate, but some appeared flawless to his untrained eye. If even half of what he'd seen was genuine and legally recoverable, it could represent financial security beyond his wildest dreams. Mark replaced the concrete blocks carefully, sealing the chamber once again. But first, he removed one gold coin and a small ruby samples he could have appraised discreetly to determine the treasure's true value. As he returned the hydraulic jack to the rental yard, Mark's mind churned with questions. Who had the legal right to this treasure? The military that had hidden it? The families of Holocaust victims from whom it had been stolen, the current property owner, which was now him. That evening, Emma chatted excitedly about her day at school, while Mark prepared dinner with hands that still trembled slightly from his discovery. He watched his daughter's animated gestures and bright smile, thinking about college funds and opportunities he'd never imagined being able to provide. "Daddy, you seem different today," Emma observed with the perceptiveness that never failed to surprise him. "Happy different? Did something good happen?" Mark knelt to her level, studying the face that was so much like her mother's. "Maybe," he said carefully, "but sometimes, when good things happen, we have to be very careful about how we handle them. Like when I found Hope, you said we had to be gentle and patient. Exactly like that, sweetheart." That night, after Emma fell asleep with Hope's recovery box beside her bed, the bird was now hopping around and would soon be ready for release. Mark sat at their small kitchen table with the coin and ruby he'd retrieved. Under the light of their camping lantern, both objects seemed to pulse with possibility. But Mark's construction experience had taught him that not all discoveries led to fortune. Sometimes they led to complications that could destroy the very things you were trying to protect. He thought about Sarah's advice during difficult decisions. When you don't know what to do, start with what you know is right. What Mark knew was right was protecting Emma and providing her with stability and security. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental responsibility. The treasure beneath their floor could be the answer to all their problems. Or it could be the beginning of dangers he couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow, he would begin the careful process of learning more about what lay beneath their home. But tonight, he simply sat in their concrete sanctuary, listening to his daughter's peaceful breathing and marveling at how quickly their desperate gamble had transformed into something that might save them both. Mark's hands shook as he set the coffee cup down at Murphy's Diner, the small-town restaurant where locals gathered for breakfast, gossip, and afternoon speculation. The gold coin felt heavy in his pocket, wrapped in tissue paper like a secret that might burn through the fabric if held too long. "You seem nervous, son," observed Frank Murphy, the diner's owner, as he refilled Mark's cup. Frank was the kind of man who'd lived in Cedar Falls his entire 73 years and considered himself an expert on human nature. "Just adjusting to the new place," Mark replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Big change for Emma and me." Frank nodded knowingly. "Bunker's got quite a history, from what the old-timers say. My grandfather used to tell stories about strange goings-on out there during the war years. Military trucks coming and going at all hours, men in suits who wouldn't talk to locals." Mark's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Really? What kind of goings-on?" "Oh, you know how stories get embellished over the decades," Frank said with a shrug. "Probably just standard military storage, though there were rumors about recovered Nazi gold and stolen artwork. Grandfather swore he saw crates being moved in the middle of the night, guarded by soldiers who acted like they were handling something mighty important." The coin in Mark's pocket seemed to grow heavier with each word. "Any idea what happened to whatever was stored there?" Frank leaned against the counter, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share local lore. "Story goes that after the war ended, some government boys came through and cleaned everything out. But Grandfather always claimed they missed something, said the ground out there was disturbed in places that didn't match the official records." Mark finished his coffee quickly and headed to his next stop, Piedmont Antiques, a shop owned by Harold Piedmont, whose reputation for discretion was matched only by his expertise in evaluating historical artifacts. The shop occupied a converted Victorian house on Cedar Falls Main Street, its rooms filled with furniture, jewelry, and collectibles spanning 2 centuries. Harold himself was a thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a scholarly owl. "I have something I'd like you to look at," Mark said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "It's just a curiosity, something I found while cleaning out the bunker." Harold's eyebrows rose with interest. "The old military installation? Fascinating piece of local history. I've always wondered what secrets that place might hold. Mark unwrapped the gold coin carefully, placing it on Harold's examination table. The older man's expression changed immediately, his scholarly detachment replaced by sharp focus. "May I?" Harold asked, reaching for a jeweler's loupe. Mark nodded, watching as Harold examined the coin with practiced precision. The antique dealer's face remained impassive, but Mark caught the slight widening of his eyes when the loupe revealed details invisible to casual observation. "This is quite remarkable," Harold said finally. "Third Reich gold, probably 1943 or 1944 mintage. The condition is exceptional. It's been stored in ideal conditions for decades." "Where exactly did you find this?" "In some debris," Mark said carefully, "mixed in with other wartime materials. Is it valuable?" Harold set down his loupe and studied Mark with sharp eyes. "This single coin is worth approximately $3,000 to the right collector. But Mr. Ellison, I have to ask, are there more where this came from?" Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. If one coin was worth $3,000, then the dozens he'd seen in that first crate alone represented a fortune beyond anything he'd dared imagine. "I'm not sure," he said, still cleaning out the place. "Why do you ask?" "Because Nazi gold has a complicated history," Harold replied, his voice taking on a serious tone. "Much of what the Reich accumulated was stolen from occupied countries and Holocaust victims. There are legal and ethical considerations when such items surface. However, if this was recovered by Allied forces during the war, the situation becomes more complex." Mark nodded, trying to appear only mildly interested while his mind raced. "What would someone do if they found more items like this?" "Depend on the circumstances," Harold said. "The proper course would be to contact authorities. The FBI has a division that handles recovered war artifacts. But between you and me, such discoveries often disappear into government warehouses, and the finders see no compensation for their honesty." Harold paused, studying Mark's face. Of course, if the items were recovered by American forces and somehow remained unclaimed after the war, the legal situation might be different. Finders' rights, property law, it can get complicated. Mark thanked Harold and left the shop with more questions than answers. The ruby would have to wait for another day, and perhaps a different expert. One revelation at a time seemed prudent when dealing with secrets that had been buried for 7 decades. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, Mark made his way to the Cedar Falls Public Library. The building was a modest brick structure that had served the community for over a century, its genealogy section containing local records dating back to the town's founding. Martha Hoffman, the elderly librarian, greeted Mark with the enthusiasm reserved for rare visitors to her historical archives. "Research project?" she asked, gesturing toward the microfilm machines and bound newspaper volumes. "Just curious about the history of my new property," Mark replied. "The old bunker facility." Martha's eyes lit up. "Oh, that's a fascinating piece of our local history. Most people don't realize how significant that installation was during the war years." She led Mark to a section dedicated to Cedar Falls World War II contributions, pulling out newspaper collections and official town records. The facility was established in 1943 as part of a classified military operation. The official designation was Supply Depot 47, but the locals always suspected it was something more important than standard supply storage. Mark spent 2 hours reading through newspaper accounts, town meeting minutes, and correspondence between local officials and military commanders. The picture that emerged confirmed Frank Murphy's grandfather's stories. The bunker had been a hub of mysterious activity during the final years of the war. A 1945 newspaper article caught his attention. "Military personnel complete final operations at local facility." The brief piece mentioned that classified materials had been secured for transport to permanent facilities, but provided no details about what those materials might have been. More intriguing was a letter in the town records from 1946, written by Mayor Thompson to the War Department. Local citizens continue to report unusual activity at the abandoned bunker facility. We request clarification regarding the current status of the property and any ongoing military operations. The War Department's response was bureaucratic deflection. The facility in question has been decommissioned and poses no security concerns to the local community. But if the facility had been completely cleared, why had Mark found a hidden chamber full of treasure? Either the military had overlooked the secret room, or someone had deliberately concealed its existence from their own commanders. As Mark drove home, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Ellison, this is Agent Thompson with the Department of Treasury. I understand you've recently purchased the old military bunker on Maple Ridge Road. I was wondering if we might schedule a time to discuss the property's history." Mark pulled over, his hands suddenly unsteady. "I'm sorry. What department did you say?" "Treasury Department, Historical Assets Division. We're conducting a review of former military installations that may have housed classified materials during World War II. It's routine, just updating our records." "I see," Mark said, though he didn't see at all. Why would the Treasury Department care about a supposedly empty bunker after 70 years? "When were you thinking? Would tomorrow afternoon be convenient? Say, 2 o'clock? Mark agreed, though every instinct screamed that this call was anything but routine. After hanging up, he sat in his parked truck for several minutes, watching traffic flow through Cedar Falls' quiet streets while his mind raced. Someone knew about the treasure. Whether they suspected Mark had found it or were simply investigating all former military sites, the timing felt ominous. His innocent inquiries at the antique shop and library may have triggered attention he couldn't afford. That evening, as Emma helped Hope practice flying in the main chamber of their bunker home, Mark watched his daughter's joy and felt the weight of impossible choices. The treasure beneath their feet could provide Emma with opportunities he'd never dreamed possible: college, travel, financial security that would last her lifetime. But it might also bring dangers that could destroy the fragile stability they'd begun to build in this concrete sanctuary. "Daddy, Hope is almost ready to go home," Emma announced, watching the small bird hop confidently around the makeshift recovery area. "Do you think he'll remember us after he leaves?" Mark knelt beside his daughter, studying her serious expression. "I think Hope will always remember the people who helped him when he needed it most," he said. "That's what gratitude means, carrying love with you even after circumstances change." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Just like how I still remember Mummy, even though she can't be with us anymore." "Exactly like that, sweetheart." As they prepared for bed, Mark made a decision. Tomorrow he would meet with Agent Thompson and carefully gauge what the government knew about the bunker's secrets. But tonight, he would document everything he'd found in the hidden chamber, creating a record that could protect Emma's interests, regardless of what complications lay ahead. Some treasures, he was learning, came with prices that weren't immediately apparent. The question was whether he was prepared to pay whatever cost might be demanded to secure his daughter's future. Agent Thompson arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, driving a black sedan that looked government-issued down to its unremarkable hubcaps. Mark watched from the bunker's main window as a tall, thin man in a grey suit emerged from the vehicle, adjusting his tie before approaching the entrance. "Mr. Ellison." Thompson extended a hand and a business card simultaneously. "Thank you for making time to meet with me." The business card was simple. James Thompson, Historical Assets Division, U.S. Department of Treasury. No phone number, no address beyond Washington, D.C. "Please, come in," Mark said, gesturing toward their modest living area. "Can I offer you coffee?" Thompson declined, his sharp eyes already scanning the interior of the bunker. Mark noticed the agent's gaze linger on the northwest corner, where the hidden chamber lay beneath innocuous-looking concrete blocks. "Interesting space," Thompson observed. "You've made remarkable progress converting it to residential use. Most people wouldn't have the vision to see potential in a place like this. My daughter and I needed a fresh start, Mark replied carefully. The price was right, and we don't mind a little renovation work. Thompson smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Of course. I understand you've been researching the facility's wartime history. Commendable curiosity. Many property owners never bother learning about their land's past. Mark's stomach tightened. Someone had reported his visits to the library and antique shop. Just seemed like the responsible thing to do. Emma's doing a school project on local history. How delightful. Thompson pulled out a small notebook. What have you learned about the bunker's operations during the war? Not much, Mark said honestly. Some kind of supply depot, apparently. The records are pretty sparse. Thompson nodded as if this confirmed his expectations. Supply Depot 47 was indeed the official designation. However, the facility's actual purpose was somewhat more specialized. It served as a temporary storage site for recovered enemy assets, stolen artwork, gold, precious stones taken from Nazi supply lines during the final months of the war. Mark's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to appear only mildly interested. Really? That sounds fascinating. Oh, it was quite an operation, Thompson continued, watching Mark's face closely. Recovery Team 7, led by a Colonel Morrison, processed hundreds of items through this facility between 1944 and 1945. Art masterpieces, religious artifacts, personal jewelry, stolen from Holocaust victims, all catalogued and prepared for return to rightful owners or appropriate institutions. What happened to it all? Mark asked. Officially, everything was transferred to secure federal facilities for processing and eventual repatriation. Thompson paused meaningfully. However, there are indications that some materials may have been overlooked during the final evacuation. The agent stood and walked to the northwest corner, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Mark held his breath as Thompson knelt and ran his fingers along the edges of the blocks, concealing the hidden chamber. Fascinating craftsmanship, Thompson murmured. These blocks show signs of being removed and replaced multiple times, almost as if someone had been accessing something beneath. The previous owner mentioned doing some utility work over the years, Mark said, though his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. Thompson stood and brushed dust from his hands. Mr. Ellison, I'm going to be direct with you. We have reason to believe this facility contains materials that were never properly recovered. If such items exist, they remain property of the United States government, held in trust for eventual repatriation to legitimate claimants. I understand, Mark said. I hope you do. Thompson's tone became more serious. Because there are others interested in this property, individuals whose motives are far less benevolent than the government's. Treasure hunters, black market antiquities dealers, people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt innocent families if they believed significant wealth was at stake. Mark's blood chilled. Are you saying Emma and I are in danger? I'm saying that certain discoveries can attract unwanted attention very quickly in today's interconnected world. A single photograph posted online, an artifact shown to the wrong person, a careless conversation overheard by interested parties, any of these could trigger responses you're not prepared to handle. Thompson handed Mark another business card, this one with a phone number. If you discover anything at all related to the bunker's wartime activities, I strongly encourage you to contact me immediately, for your own safety and that of your daughter. After the agent left, Mark sat in the sudden silence of the bunker, his hands shaking slightly. Thompson's visit had answered some questions while raising others far more troubling. The government knew about the hidden chamber, or at least suspected its existence, but they didn't seem to know that Mark had already found it. More disturbing was Thompson's warning about others who might be interested in the bunker's secrets. Mark had naively assumed that a 70-year-old mystery would remain safely buried, but apparently, some secrets never stopped attracting dangerous attention. That afternoon, Mark drove to the Cedar Falls Community College, where Professor Davies taught American history. He'd found the professor's name in one of the library's reference books as a local expert on World War II operations in Pennsylvania. Davies was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was cramped with books, papers, and artifacts from various historical periods. "The bunker installation?" she said when Mark explained his interest. "Oh, that's one of my favorite local mysteries. I've been researching Operation Golden Dawn for over 20 years. Operation Golden Dawn, the classified mission that Recovery Team 7 conducted throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio. They were tasked with intercepting Nazi supply convoys and securing stolen assets before they could be shipped to South America." Professor Davies pulled out a thick folder. "Most of the operation's records remain classified, but I've pieced together fragments from declassified documents and oral histories." She spread photographs and photocopied documents across her desk. "The fascinating thing about Golden Dawn is what happened at the operation's end. According to these documents, Recovery Team 7 processed over $200 million worth of recovered assets through various temporary facilities." Mark's hands trembled as he pretended to study the photographs. 200 million in 1940s money? Exactly. In today's currency, we're talking about resources worth well over $2 billion. Art masterpieces, religious artifacts, gold reserves, precious stones, an enormous treasure trove that was supposed to be returned to rightful owners after the war. Was it? Returned, I mean? Professor Davies's expression grew troubled. That's where the story becomes murky. Official records indicate that all recovered assets were transferred to federal custody in late 1945. But there are inconsistencies in the documentation, gaps that suggest not everything was accounted for. She pulled out a faded letter bearing military letterhead. "This is a copy of correspondence from Colonel Morrison to his superiors in December 1945. He expresses concern about irregular transfer orders and questions about the final disposition of secured assets." Morrison seemed to believe that some materials were being diverted from official channels. Mark leaned forward, studying the letter. The signature matched what he'd seen in the hidden chamber, confirming that the same Colonel Morrison had been involved with both operations. What happened to Morrison? "He died in a car accident in early 1946, just weeks after writing this letter. Some researchers have suggested it was suspicious timing, but there's no evidence of foul play." Professor Davies gathered the documents carefully. "The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened to all the recovered assets. But I've always suspected that some items remained hidden in the various temporary facilities used during the operation." "Like the Cedar Falls bunker?" "Exactly like the Cedar Falls bunker." She fixed Mark with a penetrating stare. "Mr. Ellison, may I ask what prompted your interest in this particular aspect of local history?" Mark chose his words carefully. "Emma's school project got me curious, and since we're living there now, it seemed important to understand what kind of place we'd moved into." Professor Davies nodded, but her expression suggested she sensed there was more to Mark's interest than academic curiosity. "If you ever come across anything unusual while renovating, I hope you'll consider sharing it with the academic community. Discoveries like that could reshape our understanding of wartime recovery operations." As Mark drove home, his mind churned with the implications of what he'd learned. The treasure in the hidden chamber wasn't just valuable, it was historically significant, legally complicated, and apparently still being sought by multiple parties with conflicting interests. That evening, Emma released hope into the twilight sky. The small bird circled twice around the bunker before flying toward the oak trees, where Emma had first found him. "Do you think he's happy to be free?" Emma asked, watching Hope disappear among the branches. "I think he's grateful for the second chance we gave him," Mark replied. "But sometimes freedom comes with responsibilities we didn't have before." Emma nodded seriously, as if she understood more than her 8 years should allow. Like how we have to take care of this place now, even though it's bigger and harder than our old apartment. Exactly like that, sweetheart. As they prepared for bed, Mark made a difficult decision. Tomorrow, he would document everything in the hidden chamber more thoroughly, photographing each item and recording its location. If dangerous people were already searching for the treasure, he needed evidence that could protect Emma's interests and their safety, regardless of what happened next. But tonight, he simply held his daughter close and marveled at how quickly their desperate gamble on an abandoned bunker had evolved into something far more complex than either of them could have imagined. Outside, an owl called across the empty fields, and Mark wondered if they were the hunters or the hunted in this game they'd accidentally joined. Mark sat at their small kitchen table at 3 in the morning, surrounded by printed photographs from the hidden chamber and pages of handwritten notes. Emma slept peacefully in her room, unaware that her father had spent the past week documenting a treasure worth more than most people would see in multiple lifetimes. The ruby Harold Piedmont had examined was worth an estimated $12,000. The gold coins varied in value, but averaged $3,000 to $4,000 each. The precious stones ranged from hundreds to tens of thousands of dollars per piece. Mark's conservative calculations suggested the hidden chamber contained assets worth at least $40 million, possibly much more, but the financial value paled beside the historical significance. Among the ledgers, he'd found detailed records of Nazi art theft, Holocaust victim property seizures, and Allied recovery operations spanning 3 years. The documents painted a picture of systematic looting, followed by heroic efforts to return stolen items to rightful owners. What haunted Mark was a personal journal he'd discovered in Colonel Morrison's footlocker. The final entry, dated December 20, 1945, revealed the colonel's growing paranoia about his superior's true intentions. Orders came today to transfer remaining assets to secure federal custody. But Henderson let slip that some materials are destined for private collectors, who've made substantial contributions to certain senators' campaigns. I cannot allow Holocaust victims' belongings to become political favors. Some things are worth more than careers or safety. Mark now understood why the chamber had remained hidden. Morrison had concealed the treasure not from the enemy, but from his own corrupt superiors. The colonel had died protecting assets that were meant to be returned to families destroyed by war, not sold to wealthy American collectors seeking exotic trophies. A sound outside the bunker made Mark freeze. Footsteps on gravel, barely audible but unmistakably real. He quietly moved to the window and peered through the darkness. 2 figures moved across the property with practiced stealth, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight. One carried what appeared to be a metal detector, while the other held equipment Mark couldn't identify. They weren't government agents, their clothing and movements suggested military training, but their purpose was clearly unauthorized. Mark's heart hammered as he realized Thompson's warning had been accurate. Others were indeed searching for the bunker's secrets, and they weren't waiting for daylight or permission. He crept to Emma's room and gently shook her awake. Honey, we need to go for a car ride." "What's wrong, Daddy?" Emma's voice was small and confused in the darkness. "Just some people outside who shouldn't be here. We're going to stay in town tonight, okay?" Emma nodded sleepily, trusting her father's judgment without question. Mark grabbed their essential belongings and his documentation of the treasure, then led Emma quietly to their pickup truck, parked behind the bunker. They drove to a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, where Mark bought coffee and called the Cedar Falls police. But when officers arrived at the bunker an hour later, they found no evidence of intruders. The prowlers had vanished as silently as they'd appeared, leaving only faint footprints that could have been made by anyone. "Probably just kids looking for a place to party," suggested Officer Martinez. "Old bunkers got a reputation for attracting teenagers who want to impress their friends with ghost stories." Mark nodded and thanked the officers, but he knew what he'd seen weren't teenagers. The figures had moved with military precision, searching methodically for something specific. They were professionals, which meant whoever employed them had substantial resources and serious intentions. The next morning, Mark called Professor Davies and arranged to meet at her office. He needed advice from someone who understood the historical context of what he'd discovered, someone who might help him navigate the legal and ethical complexities of his situation. "You look exhausted," Professor Davies observed when Mark arrived at her office. "Is everything all right?" Mark had spent the drive to the college debating how much to reveal. Professor Davies had been researching Operation Golden Dawn for decades, but could he trust her with knowledge that had already attracted dangerous attention? "I found something," Mark said finally, "at the bunker, something I think you should see." He pulled out a photograph of one of the ledgers, showing Morrison's handwriting and military seals. Professor Davies examined the image with growing excitement, then looked at Mark with sharp attention. "This is authentic correspondence from Colonel Morrison. Where exactly did you find this?" "In a hidden chamber beneath the bunker's main floor. There's more, much more. Documents, artifacts, evidence of everything you've been researching about Operation Golden Dawn." Professor Davies leaned back in her chair, studying Mark's face carefully. "Mr. Ellison, what you're describing could be the historical discovery of the century, but it could also be extremely dangerous. Have you contacted authorities?" "Agent Thompson from Treasury visited me last week. He seemed to know that something might be hidden there, but I didn't tell him I'd already found it." "Good," Professor Davies said, surprising Mark with her vehemence. "Thompson isn't who he appears to be. I've encountered him before during my research, and his interest in Operation Golden Dawn goes beyond official government business." Mark's blood chilled. "What do you mean?" "There are collectors, extremely wealthy individuals who specialize in wartime artifacts. They pay enormous sums for items with Nazi provenance, regardless of how those items were originally acquired. Thompson has connections to that world, connections that compromise his objectivity as a government agent." Professor Davies stood and paced to her window, looking out at the peaceful college campus. "Mr. Ellison, if you've truly found Morrison's hidden cache, you're sitting on assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But more importantly, you may have found evidence that could identify the rightful owners of stolen property families who have spent 70 years wondering what happened to their heritage. What should I do?" "That depends on what kind of man you are," Professor Davies said, turning to face him. "You could contact Thompson and surrender everything to federal custody, knowing that some items will disappear into private collections. You could try to sell pieces quietly and keep the money for yourself and Emma. Or you could do what Morrison intended, find a way to return stolen property to families who never stopped hoping for its recovery." Mark thought about Emma's college fund, about financial security, about opportunities he'd never imagined being able to provide. Then he thought about Morrison's journal, about Holocaust survivors who'd lost everything, about the colonel who died protecting assets meant for families destroyed by war. "How would someone go about finding the rightful owners?" Mark asked. Professor Davies smiled, and for the first time since this adventure began, Mark felt like he'd made a decision Sarah would have supported. "Very carefully," she replied, "and with partners who understand that some things are worth more than money." That evening, as Mark and Emma returned to the bunker, they found a note tucked under their front door. The message was brief and unsigned. "We know what you found. We'll be in touch soon to discuss terms." Mark crumpled the note, his jaw tightening with resolve. Whoever these people were, they'd made a critical error. They'd threatened his daughter's safety, which transformed this from a question of ethics into a matter of survival. Emma noticed his expression as they settled in for the night. "Daddy, are we in some kind of trouble?" Mark knelt beside his daughter, studying the face that had been his anchor through every storm they'd weathered together. "Maybe," he said honestly, "but we've faced difficult things before, haven't we?" Emma nodded solemnly. "When Mummy was sick, you said we were stronger together than apart." "That's right, sweetheart. And we're still stronger together." As Emma prepared for bed, Mark made preparations of his own. He documented the threatening note, secured copies of his treasure chamber photographs in multiple locations, and began planning for possibilities he'd hoped never to consider. Some battles chose you, regardless of whether you felt ready to fight them. Mark was learning that protecting Emma and honoring Morrison's legacy might require courage he wasn't sure he possessed. But courage, Sarah had always said, wasn't the absence of fear. It was taking that next step forward despite being afraid. Tomorrow, Mark would take whatever steps were necessary to protect his daughter and preserve Morrison's truth, even if those steps led him into dangers he couldn't yet imagine. Mark was photographing the final section of ledgers when his flashlight beam caught something he'd missed during previous visits to the hidden chamber. In the corner behind Morrison's footlocker, partially concealed by a canvas tarp, sat a smaller metal box bearing his grandfather's name, Staff Sergeant William Ellison, the 34th Infantry Division. His hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a Purple Heart medal, discharge papers dated 1946, and a letter addressed to his grandfather in Morrison's handwriting. The date was December 22, 1945, 2 days after Morrison's final journal entry. "Bill," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me and the contingency we discussed has been activated. The assets secured in this chamber represent more than military property. They are the stolen heritage of families destroyed by war, and they deserve better than to become trophies for corrupt officials and wealthy collectors." Mark sat heavily on the concrete floor, his mind reeling. His grandfather had been part of Operation Golden Dawn, had known about the hidden chamber, had kept Morrison's secret for over 70 years. The letter continued, "Your family's future ownership of this property is no accident. I've arranged for the land to be offered to your descendants when circumstances allow, ensuring that someone with integrity would eventually discover what we've preserved here. The assets in this chamber don't belong to the government or to us, they belong to the families from whom they were stolen. But until those families can be found and contacted, they need protection from people who would exploit them for personal gain." Mark's throat tightened as he read the letter's conclusion. "I'm entrusting you and your descendants with a sacred responsibility. These items must be returned to their rightful owners, not surrendered to corrupt officials or sold for personal profit. Your grandson's character will determine whether we succeeded in preserving justice or merely delayed its corruption." A photograph fell from the letter, his grandfather and Morrison standing beside the bunker's entrance, both men in military uniform, both looking serious and determined. On the back, someone had written, "The Keepers of Trust, December 1945. Mark understood now why Henry Walsh had sold him the property for such a small amount. Walsh's grandfather must have been part of the conspiracy to ensure Morrison's cash eventually reached someone who could complete the Colonel's mission. The seemingly random chain of events that had led Mark to this bunker had been carefully orchestrated decades before his birth. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Time to talk business." Mark climbed out of the chamber and opened his laptop. The email contained a single photograph. Emma walking out of Cedar Falls Elementary School that afternoon, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. No message, but the threat was unmistakably clear. Mark's hands shook with rage as he called the number that had sent the text. A man with a slight accent answered on the first ring. "Mr. Ellison, I am Victor Kozlov. My brother Dmitri and I represent collectors who are very interested in your recent discoveries. If you go near my daughter again—" "Please," Kozlov interrupted. "We are businessmen, not monsters. The photograph was simply to demonstrate our capabilities and ensure your attention. We have no intention of harming anyone if reasonable arrangements can be made." "What kind of arrangements?" "You have found items of considerable value and historical significance. Our clients are prepared to pay handsomely for certain pieces, no questions asked, no government interference, no complicated legal proceedings. Everyone benefits." Mark's mind raced. These were the others Thompson had warned him about, the black market dealers who would kill for access to Nazi gold and stolen artwork. "How much are we talking about?" Mark asked, stalling for time while he tried to process this new threat. "Our initial assessment suggests your cache contains items worth approximately $60 million on the legitimate market. On the private market, among collectors who appreciate discretion, certain pieces could bring double that amount." 60 million. The number dwarfed Mark's conservative estimates, but it also confirmed that the Kozlov brothers had inside information about the chamber's contents. Someone had been feeding them details about his discoveries. "I need time to think about this," Mark said. "Of course, but not too much time. Others are also interested in your property, and some are less patient than we are. I suggest we meet tomorrow evening to discuss specifics. There is a diner on Route 19 called Murphy's. 7 o'clock. The line went dead, leaving Mark staring at the photograph of Emma on his laptop screen. His daughter's innocent smile mocked the dangerous world he'd accidentally entered by buying an abandoned bunker and following his curiosity into hidden chambers. That afternoon, Mark called Professor Davies and arranged to meet at her home rather than her office. When he arrived, he found her packing boxes and looking disheveled. "Thank goodness you're here," she said. "My office was searched last night. Nothing was stolen, but someone went through all my Operation Golden Dawn research very thoroughly. The Kozlov brothers contacted me," Mark said. "They know about the chamber and they're threatening Emma." Professor Davies's face paled. "The Kozlovs are the most ruthless artifact dealers in the business. They specialize in Nazi loot and have connections to collectors worldwide. If they're involved, the situation has become extremely dangerous." Mark showed her Morrison's letter and the photograph of his grandfather. Professor Davies examined the documents with growing amazement. "Your grandfather was William Ellison? I've seen his name in declassified documents. He was Morrison's most trusted sergeant. This explains everything. Morrison didn't just hide the treasure randomly. He planned for your family to eventually discover and protect it." "What am I supposed to do with this responsibility?" Mark asked. "I'm a single father who lost his job and bought a bunker because it was all I could afford. I never wanted to become the guardian of stolen Holocaust artifacts." Professor Davies set down the letter and studied Mark's face. "Your grandfather and Morrison believed your family had the integrity to handle this responsibility. They were willing to risk their lives to protect these assets from corruption. The question is, do you believe they were right about you?" That evening, Emma noticed Mark's distraction during dinner. "Daddy, you seem worried about something. Is it because of the people who were walking around our house?" Mark had tried to shield Emma from the full scope of the danger they faced, but her perceptiveness made complete secrecy impossible. "There are some people who want to take something that doesn't belong to them," Mark said carefully. "Daddy has to decide how to protect what's right while keeping us safe." Emma considered this with the seriousness that never failed to amaze him. What would Mummy do? The question hit Mark like a physical blow. Sarah had faced her own impossible choices during her illness treatment options that offered hope at terrible cost. Decisions that affected both her suffering and Emma's future memories of her mother. "Mummy always said that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing," Mark replied, "even when the right thing was scary or hard." Emma nodded solemnly. "Like when she kept fighting the sickness even when she was really tired because she wanted to spend more time with us." "Exactly like that, sweetheart." That night, after Emma fell asleep, Mark sat in the main chamber of their bunker home and made his decision. Morrison's letter had revealed the truth. This wasn't just about treasure or money, or even Emma's financial security. It was about justice delayed but not denied, about keeping faith with families who had lost everything, about proving that his grandfather and Morrison had chosen their guardian wisely. Tomorrow he would meet with the Kozlov brothers, but not to negotiate surrender. Tomorrow he would begin the fight to complete Morrison's mission and protect Emma from people who treated human heritage as commodity. Mark pulled out his phone and composed a careful message to Agent Thompson. "I need to meet with you immediately. I have information about the bunker that changes everything. Some battles chose you, and this one had been choosing the Ellison family for over 70 years. Mark was finally ready to accept the responsibility his grandfather had carried in silence, and to prove that some legacies were worth any sacrifice to preserve. Agent Thompson arrived at the bunker within 2 hours of Mark's message, but he wasn't alone. A stern woman in her 50s accompanied him, introducing herself as Director Sarah Chen from the FBI's art crime team. "Mr. Ellison," Director Chen said, "Agent Thompson has briefed me on the situation. We understand you've discovered materials related to Operation Golden Dawn, and that you're being pressured by individuals with questionable motives." Mark led them into the main chamber, where he'd arranged copies of Morrison's documents on their kitchen table. Both agents examined the papers with intense focus, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances. "This is extraordinary," Director Chen murmured, studying Morrison's final letter. "We've been investigating the Kozlov organization for 3 years, but we've never had evidence directly linking them to specific stolen artifacts." "They contacted me yesterday," Mark said. "Threatened Emma, demanded a meeting. They seem to know exactly what's in the hidden chamber." Thompson's expression darkened. "Someone's been feeding them information. Our investigation into the bunker's history wasn't classified, but the details they possess suggest access to internal sources." Director Chen set down the documents and fixed Mark with a steady gaze. "Mr. Ellison, what we're about to tell you is sensitive information that could put your family in considerable danger. Are you prepared to hear it?" Mark glanced toward Emma's room, where his daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her father was about to make decisions that would determine their future. "I need to know what we're facing. The Kozlov brothers aren't just black market dealers," Director Chen explained. "They're part of an international network that specializes in laundering stolen cultural artifacts through legitimate auction houses and private collectors. They've been linked to thefts from museums, synagogues, and private collections across Europe and North America." She pulled out a tablet and showed Mark photographs of Viktor and Dmitry Kozlov, 2 men in their 40s with military bearing and calculating eyes. Viktor served in the Russian Special Forces before entering the antiquities trade. Dmitry has a background in organized crime. They're dangerous, well-funded, and persistent. Thompson leaned forward. "The problem is that we've never been able to prove their criminal activities. They're careful to maintain plausible deniability, using intermediaries and front companies to distance themselves from illegal acquisitions. Until now," Director Chen added, "if we can document their attempt to purchase known stolen artifacts from Morrison's cache, we'll finally have the evidence needed to shut down their entire operation." Mark felt a chill of understanding. "You want me to meet with them? To record them making an illegal offer?" "We want to give you that option," Director Chen clarified, "but we won't ask you to put yourself or Emma in danger without providing adequate protection and support." Thompson stood and paced to the window. "There's something else you need to know. The Treasury Department has been infiltrated by someone working with the Kozlovs. My investigation into this bunker was authorized, but someone's been sharing my reports with outside parties." "How do you know?" Mark asked. "Because the Kozlovs knew details about my visit here that I only included in classified briefings. Someone in my chain of command is feeding them information, which means we can't trust normal channels for this operation." Director Chen nodded grimly. "That's why we're here unofficially. This meeting never happened, and any cooperation between your family and law enforcement will be conducted through secure channels that bypass potentially compromised officials." Mark absorbed this information while staring at Morrison's letter. His grandfather and the colonel had faced similar corruption 70 years ago. Officials willing to sell stolen heritage to wealthy collectors for personal gain. History was repeating itself, with Emma and Mark as the unwitting guardians of justice, delayed but not forgotten. "What exactly are you proposing?" Mark asked. Director Chen opened her briefcase and removed recording equipment, sophisticated devices that looked like ordinary personal items. "If you agree to meet with the Kozlovs, We can wire you with audio and video recording capability that will document any illegal offers they make. And if something goes wrong, we'll have agents positioned around the meeting location," Thompson assured him. "You'll never be more than 30 seconds away from backup, and we'll be monitoring everything in real time." Mark picked up the photograph of his grandfather and Morrison, studying their serious, determined faces. These men had risked their lives to preserve justice, had planned decades ahead to ensure their mission could be completed even after their deaths. "I need guarantees about Emma's safety," Mark said. "Whatever happens, she can't be endangered by my decisions." "Emma will be protected," Director Chen promised. "We have a safe house facility where she can stay during the operation with full security and personnel trained in childcare. She'll be terrified. She's already been through so much, losing her mother, our financial struggles, moving to this place. I can't traumatize her further." Thompson's expression softened. "Mr. Ellison, we have a child psychologist on staff who specializes in helping children cope with their parents' involvement in law enforcement operations. Emma won't be abandoned or frightened. She'll be cared for by people who understand what she's experiencing." Mark walked to Emma's doorway and watched his daughter sleep. She looked so small in the concrete room they'd tried to make feel like home, clutching Mr. Hops while dreams played across her peaceful face. "If I do this," Mark said quietly, "and something happens to me, what becomes of Emma? What becomes of Morrison's treasure?" "Emma will be cared for according to your wishes," Director Chen replied. "As for the artifacts, if we can prove they were stolen and identify rightful owners, they'll be returned to appropriate families or institutions. If ownership can't be established, they'll be held in trust for future repatriation efforts. No government officials get to keep them for private collections." "Absolutely not," Thompson said firmly. "Morrison's mission will be completed as he intended: justice, not profit." Mark made his decision with the certainty that came from understanding his family's legacy. "I'll meet with the Kozlovs, but I want everything documented, not just their illegal offers, but evidence of the official corruption that Morrison was fighting against. If we're going to finish this, let's finish it completely." The next morning, Emma sensed the change in their routine immediately. "Daddy, why are you packing my overnight bag? Are we going somewhere?" Mark knelt to her level, choosing his words carefully. "Remember how we talked about doing the right thing even when it's scary? Well, Daddy has to do something important today, and you're going to stay with some very nice people who will take care of you." Emma's eyes filled with concern. "Are you going away like Mummy did?" The question pierced Mark's heart. "No, sweetheart, I'm coming back. But this is something Daddy has to do to protect what's right, just like Grandpa Bill would have wanted." "Grandpa Bill, who was in the war?" "Yes, he left us something important to take care of, and now it's our turn to be brave." Emma nodded with the resilience that never failed to amaze him. "Will you bring me something back?" Mark hugged his daughter tightly, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and memorizing the feeling of her small arms around his neck. "I'll bring you back the most important thing of all, the knowledge that we did what was right." That afternoon, as Director Chen's team prepared their equipment and reviewed the operation plan, Mark stood in the hidden chamber one final time. Morrison's treasure surrounded him: gold and jewels and artifacts that represented both immense wealth and immeasurable human suffering. Tomorrow evening, he would sit across from the Kozlov brothers and pretend to negotiate the sale of stolen heritage, while FBI agents recorded evidence that could finally bring justice to families who had waited 70 years for their possessions to come. Home. Mark touched his grandfather's dog tags, which he'd found in Morrison's footlocker alongside the Purple Heart. 2 generations of Ellison men had protected these secrets, had chosen duty over profit, courage over safety. Tomorrow, he would prove that their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Emma was already at the safe house, probably charming her caretakers and asking endless questions about their work. She had Sarah's curiosity and strength, qualities that would serve her well, regardless of what tomorrow brought. Mark climbed out of the chamber and sealed it one final time, knowing that when it opened again, it would either be to complete Morrison's mission or to surrender everything to forces that had corrupted justice for too long. Some battles were worth any risk to win. This was one of them. Murphy's Diner sat at the intersection of two county roads, its neon sign casting red light across the empty parking lot. Mark arrived 15 minutes early, the recording equipment hidden beneath his jacket, feeling heavier than its actual weight suggested. Director Chen's voice crackled softly through his nearly invisible earpiece. "We have visual confirmation. You're surrounded by friendlies, Mr. Ellison. Just have a normal conversation and let them do the talking." Viktor Kozlov entered the diner exactly at 7 o'clock, followed by his brother Dmitri. Both men moved with the predatory grace of professional soldiers, their eyes scanning the restaurant for threats before focusing on Mark. "Mr. Ellison," Viktor said, sliding into the booth across from Mark. His accent was slight but noticeable, his smile practiced and cold. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. This is my brother Dmitri." Dmitri nodded but remained silent, positioning himself where he could watch both the diner's entrance and Mark's movements. His role was clearly security rather than negotiation. "I understand you have a business proposition," Mark said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Viktor signaled the waitress for coffee, his manner suggesting complete confidence in the outcome of their discussion. "Indeed, my clients are very interested in acquiring certain items from your property. Items of historical significance that have been forgotten by official channels." "What kinds of items?" "Nazi gold, precious stones, artwork, religious artifacts, materials that were recovered during wartime operations but never properly processed through bureaucratic systems." Viktor's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "My clients appreciate discretion and are willing to pay premium prices for pieces that come with minimal documentation requirements." "My clients appreciate discretion." Mark leaned forward slightly, knowing the recording equipment would capture every word. "How much are we talking about?" Viktor pulled out his phone and showed Mark images of the hidden chamber that made Mark's blood run cold. Someone had been inside the bunker, had documented the treasure with professional precision. "Based on our preliminary assessment," Viktor continued, "the cache you've discovered contains approximately $40 million worth of recoverable assets. However, certain pieces would be worth considerably more to collectors who specialize in Third Reich memorabilia." "40 million?" Mark let appropriate amazement color his voice. "Perhaps more. The gold alone represents substantial value, but items with proven Nazi provenance command extraordinary prices among private collectors." Viktor swiped through more photographs on his phone. "This particular collection appears to contain pieces that were recovered from high-ranking SS officers' personal collections." Dmitri spoke for the first time, his voice low and threatening. "Of course, such valuable discoveries can attract unwanted attention from government agencies who might claim ownership based on outdated legal technicalities." Viktor nodded agreement. "My clients prefer to avoid such complications. They're prepared to offer you $12 million for immediate transfer of the most valuable pieces, with payment in untraceable cryptocurrency. No taxes, no government interference, no lengthy legal proceedings." Mark's hands trembled slightly as he processed the offer. $12 million more money than he'd ever imagined possessing, enough to secure Emma's future beyond anything he'd dreamed possible. "What guarantee do I have that this transaction would remain private?" Mark asked. "My clients value discretion above all else," Viktor replied. "Many are prominent individuals who cannot afford to have their collecting activities scrutinized by media or law enforcement. Your anonymity is as important to them as their own." Dmitri leaned forward, his expression menacing. "Of course, discretion works both ways. People who betray my clients' trust tend to experience unfortunate accidents." "Dmitri," Viktor said sharply, "Mr. Ellison is a businessman, not a threat. He understands the importance of maintaining professional relationships." But Mark had caught the exchange, and he knew Director Chen's team had recorded every word. The threat against Emma had been veiled but unmistakable. "I need to understand the logistics," Mark said. "How would such a transfer take place?" Victor's smile widened. "Very simple. Tomorrow night, you provide access to the chamber. My associates remove the agreed-upon items. You receive payment confirmation within 24 hours. Everyone benefits from a mutually profitable arrangement." "What about the items you don't take?" "You're free to do whatever you wish with remaining materials. Sell them separately, donate them to museums, contact government authorities entirely, your choice. My clients are only interested in specific pieces that meet their collecting criteria." Mark nodded, as if considering the proposal, while his mind raced with the implications of what he was hearing. The Kozlovs weren't planning to steal everything they were offering, to cherry-pick the most valuable pieces, while leaving him with the legal problems associated with the remaining artifacts. "I need time to consider this," Mark said. Victor's expression hardened slightly. "Time is a luxury we may not have. Other parties are becoming aware of your discovery, parties that may not be as reasonable in their approach as we are." "What other parties?" Dmitri answered with obvious satisfaction. "Government agents who believe they have legitimate claims to wartime recovery materials. Private investigators working for Jewish organizations seeking to identify stolen property. Academic researchers who might publicize your discovery before arrangements can be made." Victor nodded. "Such complications could make it impossible for anyone to benefit from your discovery. Better to conclude our business quickly, before circumstances become more complicated." Mark felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Through his earpiece, he could hear Director Chen's team coordinating positions, preparing for whatever came next. "There's something else you should know," Victor continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "We're aware that certain government officials have already contacted you about the bunker's contents." "Agent Thompson visited me," Mark admitted. Victor's smile became predatory. "Thompson is a reasonable man who understands the value of private arrangements. He's been very helpful in providing information about official investigations into wartime recovery sites." Mark's stomach churned as he realized the implications. Thompson wasn't just investigating the bunker, he was actively working with the Kozlovs, feeding them inside information about federal operations. "Thompson works for you?" "Thompson works for himself," Dmitri said with amusement. "But his interests align with ours when it comes to ensuring that valuable artifacts find their way to appreciative collectors rather than disappearing into government warehouses." Victor checked his watch. "I'm afraid we need a decision tonight, Mr. Ellison. My clients are eager to conclude this transaction, and delays only increase risks for everyone involved." Mark looked around the diner, noting the positions of other patrons who might be undercover agents. Everything depended on Director Chen's team being able to act when the moment came. "I have one condition," Mark said, hoping to buy more time. "I want to meet one of your clients personally. If I'm going to trust someone with something this valuable, I need to know who I'm dealing with." Victor and Dmitri exchanged glances. "That's unusual," Victor said slowly. "My clients value their privacy. Then they can find another seller." Mark replied, summoning courage he didn't know he possessed. "This is a $12 million transaction. I think meeting the buyer is a reasonable request." Dmitri's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, but Victor stopped him with a subtle gesture. "Perhaps that can be arranged. One of our clients is actually in the area, overseeing the final preparations for transport and authentication." "Where?" "The old Hartley warehouse, 2 miles from your bunker. He's there now with our technical team, preparing equipment for tomorrow's operation." Mark's blood turned cold as he realized what Victor was revealing. They weren't just planning to buy the treasure, they were already staging for its theft, with or without his cooperation. The meeting at Murphy's Diner was just a formality, a chance to see if he would cooperate voluntarily. Through his earpiece, he heard Director Chen's sharp whisper, "Warehouse location confirmed. Moving to intercept." Victor stood up, his false friendliness evaporating. "I think it's time you met our client, Mr. Ellison. He's very eager to see the man who's been causing so much excitement." Dmitri moved to block Mark's exit from the booth, his jacket falling open to reveal a shoulder holster. "I suggest you come willingly. Your daughter's safety depends on your cooperation." Mark's rage flared at the direct threat against Emma, but he forced himself to remain calm. Director Chen's team was moving, Emma was safe in federal protection, and everything was being recorded for evidence. "Fine," Mark said. "Let's go meet your client." As they walked toward the diner's exit, Victor's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. "Change of plans," he said sharply to Dmitri. "We need to move immediately." The warehouse showdown was about to begin. The Hartley warehouse squatted in darkness beside an abandoned railroad track, its broken windows and rusted siding making it look like a monument to industrial decay. Victor's sedan pulled up to the loading dock, where several other vehicles were already parked. "Remember, Mr. Ellison," Victor said as they approached the building, "cooperation ensures everyone's safety." Inside, the warehouse buzzed with activity that contradicted its derelict exterior. Professional equipment lined the central space, computer workstations, authentication devices, and transport containers that looked military-grade. A dozen men worked with the efficiency of a specialized team, preparing for what was clearly a major operation. At the center of it all stood a man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked more like a university professor than a black market antiquities dealer, but his eyes held the calculating coldness Mark had learned to recognize in truly dangerous people. "Mr. Ellison," the man said, extending a manicured hand. "I am Dr. Heinrich Kruger. Thank you for joining us this evening." Mark didn't take the offered handshake. "You're the client?" Kruger smiled, seemingly unbothered by Mark's rejection. "I represent a consortium of collectors who specialize in recovering lost cultural artifacts. We've been tracking the Morrison cache for over 30 years. Tracking it? My grandfather was SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Kruger, responsible for cultural acquisitions in occupied territories during the war. When Colonel Morrison's team intercepted our convoy in 1945, they recovered items that had been legally requisitioned for preservation in German museums." Mark's stomach churned as he understood the truth. Kruger wasn't just a black market dealer, he was the grandson of a Nazi officer, trying to recover artifacts his grandfather had stolen from Holocaust victims. "Those items were stolen from innocent families," Mark said. Kruger's expression hardened. "Those items were acquired according to the laws governing occupied territories. Morrison's interference was an act of theft, not justice." Through his earpiece, Mark heard Director Chen's voice. "Federal agents, 60 seconds out. Keep him talking." "What gives you the right to reclaim stolen property?" Mark asked. "Legal documentation," Kruger replied, pulling out a briefcase. "Requisition orders, transport manifests, inventory records, all properly executed according to wartime regulations." He opened the briefcase to reveal Nazi documents bearing official seals. "These artifacts legally belong to the German state, which has authorized their recovery through private channels, since official diplomatic requests have been ignored." Mark realized he was looking at the legal framework that had allowed Nazi looting to continue for decades after the war's end. Bureaucratic paperwork that transformed theft into requisition, murder into relocation, genocide into administrative processing. "Morrison knew what you people really were," Mark said. "That's why he hid everything." Kruger's mask of civility slipped. Morrison was a common thief who stole property belonging to the German people. His actions delayed the return of priceless artifacts to their rightful museums. "Rightful owners," Mark corrected. "The families you murdered." Kruger's face flushed with anger. "Enough sentiment. You will provide access to the chamber, or your daughter will learn how painful such defiance can become." Victor stepped forward. "Dr. Kruger, perhaps we should maintain focus on business arrangements." But Kruger was beyond such restraint now. This man has stolen German cultural property and must be made to understand the consequences of such actions. The warehouse's main door exploded inward as FBI agents swarmed into the building. Federal agents! Everyone on the ground! Chaos erupted as Kruger's men reached for weapons, while FBI agents established control positions. Victor grabbed Mark's arm, using him as a human shield, while Dmitri produced a pistol from his shoulder holster. "Nobody moves, or the civilian dies," Victor shouted. Director Chen's voice cut through the confusion. "This is Director Chen, FBI Art Crime Team. Release the civilian and surrender peacefully." Kruger stood in the center of the warehouse, his briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield. "You have no authority here. These agents are interfering with legitimate cultural recovery operations." "Dr. Heinrich Kruger," Director Chen announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to traffic stolen cultural artifacts, extortion, and making terroristic threats." Mark felt Victor's grip tighten on his arm as the man calculated his options. Around them, FBI agents had established tactical positions that made escape impossible. "Let him go, Victor," Director Chen called. "This operation is over." Victor's voice was desperate now. "The recordings they have, recordings of everything we said." Dmitri raised his weapon toward the nearest FBI agent, but Mark acted on pure instinct. He drove his elbow into Victor's ribs and broke free from the man's grip, diving toward the nearest cover as gunfire erupted in the warehouse. The battle was brief but intense. Kruger's men were professionals, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by FBI agents who had planned for exactly this scenario. Within minutes, the warehouse fell silent, except for the moans of wounded criminals and the sharp commands of arresting officers. Mark found himself on the concrete floor behind an overturned table, his ears ringing from gunfire and his hands shaking with adrenaline. Director Chen appeared beside him, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so," Mark managed. "Is it over?" "It's over," Director Chen confirmed. "Victor Kozlov is in custody, Dmitri is wounded but stable, and Dr. Kruger is demanding to speak with the German consulate." Mark stood slowly, surveying the scene of destruction. Equipment lay scattered across the warehouse floor. Transport containers had been split open to reveal specialized tools for artifact theft, and computer screens displayed detailed floor plans of his bunker. They were planning to rob the chamber tonight, Mark realized. "Whether you cooperated or not," Director Chen agreed. "The meeting at Murphy's Diner was just to see if they could make you complicit in the theft." Agent Thompson appeared from behind one of the FBI tactical vehicles, his expression grim but relieved. "The corruption investigation has been completed," he told Director Chen. Deputy Director Walsh was feeding information to the Kozlovs in exchange for payments totaling over $2 million. Mark felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. The corruption Morrison had fought against 70 years ago was still poisoning the system, but at least this time justice had prevailed. "What happens now?" Mark asked. Director Chen smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "Now we complete Colonel Morrison's mission. The artifacts will be catalogued by experts, their provenance will be researched, and they'll be returned to rightful owners or appropriate institutions. And Emma and I? You and Emma go home," Director Chen said. "You've done something remarkable, Mr. Ellison. You've helped bring justice to families who have waited 70 years for their heritage to be restored." As FBI agents processed the scene and arrested the remaining criminals, Mark thought about his grandfather and Colonel Morrison, about the courage required to choose justice over profit, truth over safety. The battle was over, but the real victory would come when stolen artifacts found their way back to families who had never stopped hoping for their return. 6 months later, Mark stood in the main chamber of their bunker home, now transformed into a comfortable living space with proper heating, modern appliances, and Emma's artwork covering the concrete walls. Sunlight streamed through new windows, casting warm patterns across furniture that no longer looked lost in the cavernous space. "Daddy, Mrs. Patterson brought us cookies," Emma announced, skipping into the room with a plate of chocolate chip treats and their elderly neighbor trailing behind. Mrs. Patterson had undergone a remarkable transformation since the FBI raid made national news. The woman who had once criticized Mark for buying the concrete tomb now treated him like a local hero and insisted on bringing Emma homemade treats twice a week. The documentary crew finished filming yesterday. Mrs. Patterson said, settling into the comfortable armchair that had replaced their rickety kitchen table. Emma was wonderful on camera. She's got her father's courage and her mother's grace. The documentary was one of many projects that had emerged from the Morrison cache discovery. Professor Davies was writing a book about Operation Golden Dawn. The Smithsonian was preparing an exhibition about wartime art recovery, and several Holocaust remembrance organizations were working to identify families who could reclaim stolen property. Mark's phone buzzed with a text from Director Chen. Another match confirmed. The Goldstein family menorah will be returned to surviving relatives in Montreal next month. Each successful identification brought Mark satisfaction that exceeded any financial reward. The cache had yielded over 200 pieces that were being returned to rightful owners' jewelry that had belonged to grandmothers, religious artifacts that had anchored family traditions, photographs and documents that had been feared lost forever. "Any word about our college fund?" Emma asked, reading over Mark's shoulder with the casual intrusion that 8-year-olds considered their natural right. Mark smiled and ruffled her hair. "The reward program approved our application. $2 million for information leading to the recovery of stolen cultural artifacts." Emma's eyes widened. $2 million? That's enough for college and graduate school and maybe even buying you a new truck. It's enough for whatever dreams you decide to chase, sweetheart. The federal government's reward program for art theft recovery had provided financial security beyond anything Mark had imagined, but more importantly, it had validated Morrison's faith in his family's integrity. They'd chosen justice over the Kozlov's $12 million offer, and that choice had brought rewards that money couldn't measure. Miss Rodriguez arrived for their weekly tutoring session, her arms full of books and her face bright with enthusiasm. Emma's teacher had become a close family friend during the months of media attention and legal proceedings, providing stability and support when the outside world felt overwhelming. "How's our young historian today?" Miss Rodriguez asked, giving Emma a warm hug. "I finished my essay about Grandpa Bill and Colonel Morrison," Emma announced proudly. "Want to hear it?" Mark settled into his chair as Emma retrieved her composition notebook. The essays she'd written about their adventure had helped process everything that had happened while sharing their story with classmates who were fascinated by the idea of finding treasure in abandoned bunkers. "Heroes aren't always soldiers who fight battles," Emma read aloud. "Sometimes heroes are people who choose to do the right thing even when it's scary or hard. My great-grandfather Bill and his friend Colonel Morrison were heroes because they protected stolen treasures for 70 years until someone could return them to the families who lost them." She paused dramatically, a skill she'd developed during television interviews. "My daddy is a hero too, because he kept their promise even when bad people tried to make him break it. Heroes are people who remember that some things are more important than being safe or rich." Mark's throat tightened with emotion as Emma continued reading. Sarah would have been so proud of their daughter's wisdom and courage, of the young woman she was becoming in this concrete sanctuary they'd learned to call home. After Emma finished her essay and Miss Rodriguez had reviewed her homework, Mark walked outside to check on their newest project. Where the hidden chamber's entrance had been, they were building a memorial garden dedicated to Holocaust victims and the Allied soldiers who had worked to return their stolen property. Professor Davies had suggested the memorial as a way to honor both the victims and the heroes of Morrison's story. Local veterans organizations had contributed funds. Holocaust remembrance groups had provided historical context, and Emma had insisted on including a section for Hope's Landing, the spot where she'd found her injured bird and learned about the power of healing. The garden was still mostly potential, but Mark could envision how it would look when completed. Pathways would wind between commemorative plaques, native plants would provide habitat for wildlife, and a central monument would list the names of families who had reclaimed their heritage through Morrison's hidden cache. As evening approached, Mark and Emma prepared dinner together in their renovated kitchen. The propane camping stove had been replaced by modern appliances, but they still preferred eating at their small table in the center of the main chamber, surrounded by the history they'd helped preserve. "Do you think Mummy knows about our adventure?" Emma asked as they sat down to eat. Mark considered the questions seriously. Emma had been asking more about Sarah lately, processing her mother's absence through the lens of their shared experience with courage and loss. "I think Mummy knows that we chose love over fear," Mark said finally, "that we protected something important instead of taking the easy path. Those are the kinds of choices that make her proud, wherever she is." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "And Grandpa Bill probably told her all about it, since they're both together now. I'm sure he did." That night, after Emma fell asleep in her bright, comfortable room, Mark sat in the main chamber and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, they'd been facing eviction, custody battles, and a future that looked increasingly desperate. Now they lived in a home that had become a symbol of justice restored, with financial security that would last Emma's lifetime, and a story that had inspired people around the world. But the greatest reward wasn't money or fame. It was the knowledge that they'd honored the legacy of courage that had been passed down through 3 generations of their family. Mark's grandfather and Colonel Morrison had planted seeds of justice that had taken 70 years to bloom, but their faith in future generations had been rewarded. Mark pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages that arrived daily. Thank you notes from families who had reclaimed stolen heirlooms, updates from researchers who were using Morrison's documents to identify other hidden caches, invitations to speak at conferences about the importance of protecting cultural heritage. Each message reminded him that their adventure wasn't really over. It had evolved from a desperate gamble on an abandoned bunker into a lifelong commitment to preserving history and protecting the vulnerable. Emma appeared in her doorway, clutching Mr. Hops and looking sleepy but determined. "Daddy, I had a dream about Mummy. She said to tell you that hidden treasures come in all different shapes." Mark opened his arms, and Emma curled up beside him on the couch, just as she had during the difficult months after Sarah's death. "What kind of shapes?" "Sometimes they look like gold and jewels," Emma said thoughtfully. "But sometimes they look like courage, or family, or doing the right thing even when it's scary." Mark held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow from her naturally. "What do you think our hidden treasure looks like?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "I think it looks like home," she said finally. "The real kind of home that you carry with you no matter where you live." As they sat together in their concrete sanctuary, surrounded by the warmth they'd created from cold walls and forgotten spaces, Mark understood that Emma was absolutely right. The greatest treasure they'd discovered wasn't buried in hidden chambers or documented in ancient ledgers. It was the love that had sustained them through impossible choices, the courage that had carried them through dangerous challenges, and the knowledge that some legacies were worth any sacrifice to preserve. Outside, an owl called across the fields they now owned, and Mark smiled, remembering the first night they'd spent in the bunker. Everything had changed since then, but the most important things, Emma's laughter, their unbreakable bond, their commitment to doing what was right, remained constant. Some treasures, Mark had learned, were hidden in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the act of protecting them revealed that you'd been the treasure all along.